we know a big part of your studies on Shia minorities in contemporary world is part of the big project you had in a university project. I mean, huge effort from you and your colleagues about this subject. It's obvious that you are very much interested about this topic, but it's difficult for me to understand how can you convince the academic part of the United Kingdom and especially the founders of this to accept the importance of this subject, because normally people don't understand the importance of the Shia issues in the modern world.
Yeah. I mean, I think the situation has changed, and I think it's also problematic, the reasons for why it's changed. I mean, if we look at academic research on Shia Islam in the West more generally, before the Islamic Revolution, only a handful of scholars were interested seriously in Shia Islam, and they were seen as outsiders, eccentric scholars.
Madalong, for example.
Yes, exactly. The situation has completely changed after the Islamic Revolution, after 1979, because suddenly there was, a major revolution in a Shia majority country led by Shia clerics based on Shia ideology, and suddenly people felt, we missed something.
And affected the whole Muslim world.
And it affected the whole Muslim world, and it had wider global repercussions. So then we see a surge in interest in Shia Islam, particularly in the Iranian context. And I think it's a bit of a double-edged sword. I mean, on the one hand, yes, it's good that people are more interested in Shia Islam and they give it, the credit it deserves and the attention it deserves, but obviously it's also politically motivated. And we see the same happening after 2003. One or two people looked at Shiism in Iraq before 2003. A handful of people. I think two, we can count them on one hand. Now, obviously, it's a major topic. So many people are working on Shiism in Iraq. Before 2003, nobody heard of Ayatollah Sistani. Nobody had a clue who he was. Now everybody knows about him. So many papers and books published around him. And again, I think it's a bit of a double-edged sword, because we can see that the academic interest is very often triggered by political developments and of
political
course
motivations.
Yes, and of course the political developments, they also shape then the research agendas that are supported, and that's obviously problematic. So I think what you need to try to do as a researcher is obviously refer to these developments, but make sure that you can get your message across, and that you're not entirely determined in terms of the work you're doing by these sort of wider geopolitical developments and agendas that emerge. So in that sense, it's a bit easier to make the case for more research on Shia Islam because of the Islamic Revolution in 1979 and the toppling of Saddam in 2003. But again, it's sort of navigating your position as an academic researcher. You don't want to be shaped and determined by these political agendas. You want to give voice to Shia communities themselves to understand, their experiences, their points of view, and that obviously requires an intensive engagement with Shia communities.
Yeah, it's important what you said about the double-edged sides of the sword of the Shia studies. One of the important points of your studies was your avoiding of being a part of the anti-Shia slogans in Western society, or become a Shia supporter to show that you are part of the Shia propaganda as well. This is very difficult to keep yourself at the middle of these two different sides.
Sure. Yeah, that's true. I mean, one way how we dealt with this is obviously by engaging with Shia communities themselves. So the book that is there, and the project that I did, for example, on Shiite communities in London. All these are based on ethnographic research. Going to the communities, talking to people, making sure that their voices are heard, and their perspectives are included. To show dimensions of the contemporary communal life of Shiites across the world that have been overlooked. And at the same time, obviously, you need to maintain what we might call academic neutrality. You're not, supporting a particular political agenda. Also acknowledging the internal diversity of contemporary Shiism. That, in so many ways. I mean, culturally, obviously, in terms of ethnic identities, but also in terms of clerical allegiances, which senior clerics, which Majah Taqlid do people follow, and that obviously has an impact on how they practice Shia Islam, how they understand Shia Islam, and also, their political allegiances, which are also, very diverse, and there are different, political viewpoints in contemporary Shia communities. So I think in terms of, as you said, not falling to this kind of pro-Shia camp, it's by illustrating, yes, that there is a lot of internal diversity within contemporary Shia communities in all sorts of ways, and again, it's to acknowledge this and to document this and to discuss this.
I think your studies is a bit more difficult than other people who are working on other Muslim communities, because, for example, if you work on something related to Saudi Arabia or Wahhabism or Sunnism or Kuwait, United Arab Emirates, first of all, you have less enemies. Second, you have far more resources and financial support for that.
Yeah.
And your job to talk about Shia minorities in the Western society and other part of the world is more hectic and more fragile and more lonely than other jobs.
I suppose, the idea behind this book and, the conference that led to the publication of this book in 2016 at the University of Chester was obviously to bring scholars working on Shia Islam together, and in particular scholars who work on Shia minorities in very different countries, from Europe to Africa, Eastern Europe, Sri Lanka, South America, North America, and so on. So that, this kind of, we are lone rangers doing our work, we come together and we have different disciplinary backgrounds. Yes, there is, there are less resources from state actors available, that's true, but I think it's also an advantage because, if you get funding from official sources, it might delimit your research, whereas if you get funding from a private foundation, for example, this project on Shia communities in London and this book was supported by the Gerda Henkel Foundation, which is sort of associated to a major multinational company in Germany who do washing powder. So it's very harmless. They're just interested in supporting your research. They're not interfering in your research.
That's very important.
They're not telling you, you can talk about this, you can't talk about this, because it's a company, it's a private foundation. They've been interested in promoting research on Islam more generally. So I think you need to find avenues of securing funding that at the same time ensures your independence and autonomy, where nobody's sort of interfering in your research agendas. Yeah,
and the value about your integrity and your independence.
Absolutely, and they want to see good academic research.
That's good.
That's for them the most important.
Let's talk about the books. You mentioned about that already. Can you tell us what was the reason to collect these articles and what was the base of the articles?
Yes, we had a conference as part of the project on Shia communities in London and looking at Shia minorities across the world more generally. We had a conference in 2016 at the University of Chester on Shia minorities in non-Muslim countries. So the deliberate focus was to look at Shia minorities that are positioned within Muslim minorities across the world. So that was, I think, the first conference that was ever organized around this theme, and brought very different scholars together, from historians to anthropologists, political scientists, scholars in Islamic studies. And it was a great privilege to have this conference, because for the first time people who've been working in a sense more or less independently on Shia minorities in different contexts came together and could share their research and see sort of similarities and differences, and again also to include some sort of unique perspectives on Shia communities in countries that we are not aware of, or we hardly know anything about the Shia presence in these particular countries. So there was a conference that was sort of part of the project, and then obviously we thought, let's bring it together in a publication, because it would make hopefully useful contribution by, if you like, decentering a bit Shia studies, because most research on Shia communities has been looking at the Middle East, South Asia, and we wanted to shift the focus away from, if you like, the Islamic heartland, from Muslim majority context, and look at specifically, what does it mean to be Shia Muslim in a minority context, in a Muslim minority context,
especially in Western world.
In the Western world, I mean, we have examples from South America, from Sri Lanka, from Cambodia. So we're not just looking at Europe or North America, but we're looking at non-Muslim countries more generally. That some of them have new Muslim minorities, some of them have more established historical Muslim minorities. And we were looking at, what role, what is the situation of Shia communities in these very, very specific contexts.
بحرین، سال 1390. مجسمه مروارید را به دستور حاکمان تخریب می کنند. مجسمه‌ای که 6 بادبان داشت به سمت آسمان و مرواریدی را بالای آن بادبان‌ها نگه می داشت. 6 بادبان که نمادی از 6 عضو شورای همکاری خلیج فارس باشد، اما حالا نماد مبارزه با آن اعضا شده بود. 6 عضوی که این بار برای سرکوب مردم معترض بحرین همکاری می کردند. مشت‌های گره کرده بحرینی‌ها با شهادت علی عبدهادی 21 ساله این بار شکل خیزشی را به خود گرفت که تا به امروز ادامه دارد. مجمع الجزایر بحرین همواره مورد مناقشه بود، از درگیری سعودی‌ها و مصری‌ها و عمانی‌ها تا اشغال توسط پرتغالی‌ها و عثمانی و سرانجام بریتانیایی‌ها. در دوره قاجار دولت عثمانی ادعای مالکیت بر بحرین را می کند، اما بریتانیا بحرین را متعلق به ایران می داند، ولی می گوید تا ایران حداقل 4 ناو جنگی در خلیج فارس نداشته باشد از بحرین محافظت می کند. بریتانیا نقشه های دیگری در سر داشت و چندی نگذشت که بحرین را کشوری مستقل دانست. سرانجام یک نظرسنجی محدود و نامعتبر به جای همه پرسی بحرین را کشوری مستقل کرد. تصمیمی که اعراب را به خواستهشان توازن شیعه عربی رساند.
هیچ تاریخ این مملکت غم اینقدر جانگاه ندیده، غم اینقدر سنگین احساس نکرده. بنا به همین ملاحظات از کنوار ملت و دولت ایران بحرین را جزء لایحه‌جزای ایران شناختند. بحرین از زمان هخامنشیان که به عنوان یکی از توابع استان پارس اداره می شده تا به امروز همیشه جزء لاینفک شاهنشاهی ایران بوده است.
با آغاز بهار عربی سال 2010 مردم بحرین هم در اعتراض به حاکمان بحرین به خیابان آمدند و خواستار برکناری آنها و تدوین قانون اساسی جدیدی شدند. اما این بار نه بریتانیا، بلکه عربستان و امارات سایه شوم خود را بر مردم معترض انداختند و مردم بی‌دفاع را به گلوله بستند. با گذشت 11 سال از انقلاب مردم بحرین که تلاش آنها هنوز ادامه دارد، فضای سیاسی با تشدید سرکوب‌ها پایه‌های استبداد آل خلیفه را محکم‌تر کرده است و احزاب و گروه‌های عدالت طلب و آزادی‌خواهی مثل الوفاق حذف شدند.
أوجه كلمة لكل شاب شريف ولكل شاب يعني يعشق البحرين بأن يواصل على هذا النهج، يواصل على نهج الإباء، نهج الدفاع عن الوطن، نهج أن نطق بالحق مهما كان حتى مع وجود السلطان الجائر. نحن أصحاب حق ولا بد أن نستمر على هذا النهج حتى ولو اعتقلنا. بالعكس يعني الاعتقال زاد من أسرارنا، الاعتقال خلانا نقتنع أزيد إن يعني الحكومة ظالمة.
هدف جنبش انقلابی مردم بحرین ایجاد دموکراسی و یک نظام سیاسی برآمده از اراده مردمی و انتخابات آزاد است. حکومت آل خلیفه بدون توجه به مردم و با کمک عربستان و امارات بر بحرین مسلط است. اما در حقیقت افزایش مخالفت‌ها و اعتراضات مردمی در بلند مدت بیش از پیش مشروعیت و مقبولیت این حکومت را با چالش مواجه خواهد ساخت و میتوان گفت هنوز مروارید امید این بار نه در میدانی شهری بلکه در دلهای مردم نوید پیروزی را میدهد و آتشی گسترده را بر بستر پوسیده حکومت آل خلیفه میافکند.
When I read your book, perhaps the biggest part or one of the most important part of the book is your introduction with Dr. Yafa Shenik. Can you tell us, because this the title of this about the homeland is Hussein, it's very, for me as a Iranian Shia person who lives in the UK, it's very tempting, a very warm topic, very hot topic. Can you tell us what is in your introduction and why did you choose this provocative title?
Yeah, I mean, my homeland is Hussein. I mean, this is actually inspired by a eulogy that is recited, you know, during Muharram, during Ashura, after the majalis, after the morning meetings, the morning congregations. Watani al-Hussein. That's sort of translation. My homeland is Hussein, and I think it came through in some of the contribution as well, because what this sort of the slogan or the title of this particular eulogy illustrates is a kind of, the creation of what we might call a spiritual homeland. So for an Iranian or an Iraqi Shia living in the West, yes, they might have a connection to their country of origin, but I think through the generations this connection diminishes very often gradually, and people then identify more as Shia Muslims than maybe as Iraqi or Iranian Shias. And there is obviously, if you like, a physical transnational connection. There's the shrine of Imam Hussein in Karbala, and people do pilgrimages to this place to connect physically with the person of Imam Hussein as part of the pilgrimage. But I think there's also a very strong symbolic and spiritual dimension, that in a sense my homeland is beyond national boundaries, is beyond ethnic identity markers, is beyond being British, Iraqi, American. Hussein as a kind of symbolic figure of veneration that brings the Shia communities together. I mean, there is a contribution in the book by Nur Zaidi, who's done research on second generation Pakistani Shia Muslims in North America, and these are their parents or grandparents came from Pakistan, and they've been living, and they were very American, very much integrated in American society, very middle upper class, very well educated professionals. And she was Nur Zaidi, she was talking about, well, how do you see yourself? And it was interesting to see that they didn't really identify as Pakistanis as such. They didn't really identify with the country of origin of their parents or grandparents. But they would say, particularly after 2003, when the shrine cities in southern Iraq, Najaf and Karbala, were open again, and then people could perform pilgrimage to these places, they said, our spiritual homeland is Karbala.
That's very important point, especially when you talk about transnationalism and multi-locality. That automatically reminds me of Arba'in. And you mentioned Arba'in in several parts of this book, not you and your other contributions. I'd like to ask you about what is important in Arba'in ritual in your point of view.
Well, there are different elements to it, and I think, as you said, the example of Arba'in nicely illustrates the multi-locality, how Shia communities are embedded in different contexts. So they are embedded in the local context, they have transnational connections, and then there's also this kind of spiritual, symbolic connection to Imam Hussein we talked about. So in the UK, in London, most famously, but also in Edinburgh and in other UK cities, you have public processions by Shia Muslims, through the city centre of London during the day of Ashura, but also during Arba'in. And this is obviously a very important statement. It's not just, I think, a religious statement, it's also, in a sense, a political statement to mark the presence in the public arena.
They call it Shia March.
Yeah, so it's a kind of Shia March, yes, exactly. So to particularly, as we talked about earlier, the fact that Shias are marginalized, their importance and presence is not really recognized.
To present the Shia might.
Yeah, to show, well, yeah, I mean, if you want to put it this way, but, to show the presence of the Shia community, to, carve out a space in the public arena, because, if you are just doing your rituals and activities in the community centers outside of the public, people don't see it, they don't notice it. And in a sense, you could say it also perpetuates maybe this perception of marginality and being a very small minority. But going to the public and doing the processions is obviously a very important statement to tell the public, we are here, we are part of British society, or we are part of this particular society. So that's, if you like, the local context and the role Arba'in plays in the local context. And then, of course, people perform pilgrimages from across the world to Karbala on Arba'in. So it in this sense sort of reinvigorates a transnational connection with the kind of the spiritual, or one of the spiritual centers of global Shia Islam, the shrine of Imam Hussein in Karbala, but also with Shia communities from across the world that participate in the procession. And I think it's very interesting to see that, which again shows the multi-locality, that very often, particularly international pilgrims going from the West in particular, going to Arba'in, they like to carry their national flag. So there are Iraqis living in Germany, and they're part of a group, and they do the walk from Najaf to Karbala and carry a German flag.
I've seen many people with Swedish flag, British flag, US flag, Iranian flag, different types.
So again, to say, yes, we are a multicultural, multi-local community. We come from different parts of we're a global community. So in that sense, it's also I think the procession is also a very interesting marker of the unity of global Shiism in a kind of a spiritual, symbolic sense, but also of its diversity. And the fact, yes, we are Shia Muslims from Germany, and we show where we're coming from, which country in a sense we represent, or we are Shia Muslims from Sweden or from Britain or from the US. So I think you can very nicely see the different layers of identities that are articulated there. So in that sense, yes, the Arba'in processions very well articulate the multi-locality. It has a meaning at a local level when it's done by Shia minorities in the West, and in terms of the actual pilgrimage on Arba'in to Karbala. It reinvigorates the transnational connections, the symbolic spiritual connection, and it also gives a sense of the unity of the Shia world, while also articulating its eternal diversity.
A few decades ago, people must choose between their nationality or ideology or religion. I mean, many people used to say, I'm a Shia Muslim, I'm Muslim, that's more important than my nationality, or I'm Iranian or British or Iraqi, and this is more important than my religion. It seems after 2003, gradually, you don't have to choose between your nationality and your religion as a Shia, and people can live with both of them at the same time. How can you describe this?
Yeah, absolutely. I think
change?
It's a very simplistic view, and sometimes this is also sort of imposed by political discourses, public discourses in the West around integration of Muslims. So the sense you need to decide where you belong to. You can't belong to two countries, or you can't have different identities at the same time. The reality is much more complex, of course. People have a variety of identity markers. Religion is one, and in particular when it comes to migrants, you have these dual identities, Iraqi, British, and so on, and they coexist. And sometimes, for individuals, they coexist quite comfortably. The children of migrants, in particular, they know to navigate these different spaces, and they know to express the Iranian identity when they're in an Iranian community. Sure. There are very good in expressing the British identity if they're in a British context, in the religious context, their Shia identity. So I think in reality what we see is a much more multi-layered, much more complex understanding of how individual identities are constructed. They are sort of pieces of a puzzle that come together.
One of the very important aspects of your book is finding contributors and articles on the area that normally we don't know there are Shia minority there, for example Sri Lanka, Argentina or something like that. And that shows the diversity of your research and the geographic, demographic part of the research. This is very important. I think this is for the first time that in the Western academia someone could manage to bring up together these scholars in a specific book. And this is very important part of your book.
Yes, no, we were very happy to have one contribution on Shia Muslim communities in Buenos Aires, in Argentina. We don't really know much about
South Asia, for example.
And then we have a contribution on Shia Muslims in Sri Lanka. Of course, there is a very historical Muslim minority
Balkans,
in Sri Lanka, but we don't know much about the Shia community there. And the Balkans, we have a contribution on the Bektashis. Again, it depends a little bit on how we use the Shia label. It's a Sufi order, but that has strong sort of Shia tendencies. What is the contemporary understanding of Bektashi identities in Eastern Europe, and what's the sort of the Shia element in these identities? So yes, I think we were very fortunate to highlight Shia presences across the globe that are usually not on the radar, like South America, Sri Lanka. We have a contribution on Cambodia.
It's very important.
So, and again, we are looking obviously at the local context, but also how they identify with global Shias.
Yeah, and especially when you match them together in a different categoric part of the book, you categorize these different articles skillfully in an academic way.
Yes, I mean, we try to sort of address major themes. One is obviously localization. So, yes, they are part of the global Shia community. They have links to Iraq and Iran, but they are based in Cambodia.
Sure.
They're based in Argentina. So, how do they adapt the articulation of the Shia identity to the local context?
We call it glocal.
Yeah, exactly. Absolutely. You know, it's very much sort of examples of very, very diverse local Shia identities. Yeah.
Last question. You mentioned you're moving from Birmingham University to the Lund University. What is your current or future project?
At the moment, I'm finishing a project. I have another year to go on the transnational role of clerical authority in Shia Islam, the role of the Marja'iyya. So we look both at sort of kind of intellectual history of the Marja'iyya in the last 50, 60 years. We're looking at the kind of transnational connections, and we're also looking at, if you like, ritual activities or cultural production. So the role rituals play, poetry plays, art plays, in contemporary Shia communities. So that project is coming, well, we are in the final year. So that's sort of coming to an end. After that, I'm not entirely sure. I have some ideas. I mean, I spent more than a month in Kuwait doing research among Shia communities there. And there is, I think, a gap in terms of research, so that might be an option to carry on. And then I'll have also an interest in the intellectual history of Islam more generally. And one theme that I'm interested in and thinking of exploring is the notion of the concept of civilization in Islam, tamaddun. You know, how it is involved throughout Islamic intellectual history. So I have some ideas, but nothing concrete at that stage.
Thank you very much for your...
My pleasure. Thanks for me.